rumored that there would be a small turnout tonight because of the weather, but not Ashfield. I know Berlin, I live here, you may know, and I'm also on the executive committee of the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. So I'd like to welcome you tonight and introduce the staff members from the council who are going to give a presentation and then ask for opinions and answer questions. And Kimberly McPhee and Mary Krause are the two, and I will hand it over to them.
Thank you, Bill. I want to just explain how we'd like the meeting to run, especially because it would be nice maybe to get done a little bit before 8 and get you all home safely. I have a brief presentation that I'd like to go through, and I ask that you hold all of your questions or comments until the presentation is done. We have about 10 questions that we'd like to ask you and get feedback on, and we'd also like to hear the questions that you have as well. So, with that, did everyone get an opportunity to sign in? Because that would be the way that we can keep you up to date on any other meetings or any changes in some of the materials that you may have picked up on the table. So if you didn't sign in, if you could please do that before you leave, that would be great. The other people that we have here tonight are Wendy Sweetser-Ferris from the Franklin Land Trust, whom some of you probably know, and Bob O'Connor from the Mass Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And so they're our partners in this project and are here tonight to help answer questions that you might have. So the agenda, the PowerPoint that I'm going to go through will present this concept of federal forestry designation, and I'll talk about some of the ideas and the feedback that we've already gotten in the process because we've held several community meetings so far. And then the majority of the meeting is going to be devoted to getting feedback from you and helping us answer the questions that we'll go through at the end of this PowerPoint. So what we'd like to do is describe this potential partnership that could increase economic development opportunities for forestry-based businesses and provide funding and technical assistance for private landowners who wish to conserve and continue working their forested land. A new federal designation could be created that would include 11 towns in Franklin County and 9 towns in Berkshire County. And this map is also over on the table in a larger format if you'd like to look at that after the meeting. So the potential partners in this designation would be the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, working with the towns in Franklin County, the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, working with the towns in Berkshire County, the various agencies of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the 3 branches of the U.S. Forest Service. So why pursue a federal designation in these 2 counties? How could the federal designation strengthen the connections between forest conservation and economic development? And what other connections could be made or strengthened? So in other words, how could we add to this slide? And keep this slide in mind as we go through the presentation and have our discussion. And what you'll hear tonight is the draft of a framework that would hope to link all of these elements and explore all of the interconnectedness of these elements. And your input and the input that we've received from other towns and other stakeholders is really critical to shaping what this relationship would be. So the FRCOG, along with the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission and the Franklin Land Trust, was hired to conduct the community outreach in their regions and to gather information that would help shape this potential federal designation. So we're looking to find out what the towns need, what do private landowners need, what do local businesses need, and how can the resources of the U.S. Forest Service meet these needs. The participation in this potential designation is optional. The town within that study area that I showed you earlier can opt not to participate if the designation does move forward. So, a little bit of background on the project. This is not a traditional U.S. Forest Service national forest where the federal government would own the land. The land in this potential designation would remain in private ownership. Forestry activities could continue, and other values that the forests provide, like clean drinking water, habitat, carbon sequestration, all of those would be protected by conservation restrictions that are executed with a willing landowner. So the land remains in private ownership. And I've got a slide that talks about what a conservation restriction is. And again, at the end of the presentation, if there are specific questions about how a conservation restriction works, that's what Lindy's here for, to help me with that. So conservation restrictions or conservation easements permanently remove the rights to develop a property, but they preserve the right to continue farming the land. For example, if you had an agricultural preservation restriction on your property, to log, to create trails, to protect habitat. Again, it keeps the land in private ownership and on the tax rolls in the town. And a land that has a conservation restriction on it can be sold or passed on to another private landowner. So some of the tax implications of land with a CR, as many of you know, Chapter 61 reduces property taxes to owners who agree to keep their land in forestry or farming. And tax revenues under a CR would be equal to or greater to the tax revenues of land that is enrolled in Chapter 61. Forest management practices on land in this potential designation that had a CR that was funded by the U.S. Forest Service, those practices would continue to be the same as those that you're used to adhering to if your land is enrolled in Chapter 61 and you're logging it right now. CRs could be held by the state, the town, or a local land trust. They wouldn't be held by the U.S. Forest Service. So some of the potential benefits of this new federal designation, these are some of the ones that were talked about kind of at the beginning of the project, and I have some slides later on that talk about some of the other ones that people have mentioned. But the U.S. Forest Service could own or lease a building for a visitor center, own or lease land that could be used as a demonstration forest, for example. Also, a technical resource center that could be staffed by Forest Service personnel. And this designation could bring a new source of funding to the area, one that we cannot access right now since we do not have a national forest in Massachusetts. So, showing the slide again, because it's one of my favorite slides in the PowerPoint presentation. So, thinking about these interconnections between forest conservation and economic development. So again, keep this in mind as I kind of go through a summary of the input that we've received so far in our public outreach process. So some of you may remember the project that the FRCOG recently completed, the Regional Plan for Sustainable Development for Franklin County. And one of the top 3 natural resource goals that was identified was to protect our extensive forest resources that we have in the county. Through the meetings that we held in November, which were sub-regional meetings, some of you might have attended those, and through the community meetings that we've held thus far, we've been working to gather input to inform or to kind of craft a vision for the designation. How can we conserve the forest to protect their habitat and the recreation and economic development values of the forest resources? And how can that economic development potential be sustainable over time? We've also gathered input on ideas for using the forest raw materials and the finished products. Tourism, boosting tourism has been important for some of the towns that we've talked to so far. But in general, we're trying to gauge the level of interest of the towns in this idea. And remember, everything that I say tonight, everything that you see in these slides, it's all a draft at this point. It's a working draft, a draft in progress. So there's something in particular when we get to the question and answer session that you really don't like, we want to hear that, or if there are things that you really do like, we want to hear that, and if you have new ideas, we want to hear that as well. So, some of the key concerns that have been expressed so far, loss of local tax revenue for land in federal or state ownership. What are the potential impacts on municipal services if the Forest Service were to have a visitor center or demonstration forest? Are there going to be increased costs for road maintenance, emergency response services? The existing pilot program, lack of reliable payments to the towns from this program. Concerns about the potential impacts of federal designation on the working forests and the local economies of our counties. And the need to better understand the actual incentives or support that can be provided to the towns, the landowners, and the forest-based businesses by the U.S. Forest Service and or the state. Some additional key concerns, the need for the process to be locally driven and locally supported, and that's why we're out here tonight. The need for the state to better manage and maintain their own forests and recreational facilities. And the need for conservation restrictions to be flexible to allow for working forests, the activities associated with those, habitat protection, and or recreational opportunities, depending on what the landowner's needs are. The need for reduced regulations to support a sustainable forestry operations, and the needs for towns to be able to review and comment on any legislation that's proposed for the designation. So at the end of the process, there's going to be legislation that's crafted and sent to the state, and the towns want to make sure that they have the opportunity to comment on that, or if things are changed at the state level, to comment on that as well, or to opt out of the process if things are changed too dramatically or not to their liking. So some of the key interests, the opportunity to increase the conservation of forests and to increase sustainable recreational tourism have been expressed. Some people have seen the designation as an opportunity to provide additional money towards these things. Creating and expanding markets for local wood, and more technical assistance to landowners and the local foresters they work with to manage their land. So, at the end of the community outreach process, the COG and our other project partners will draft a plan that describes the elements or the framework of this proposed federal designation. And it will include discussion of the vision and goals for the designation, the key provisions, the towns within that area that I showed you earlier that are interested in the designation, locations of any federally owned projects like the proposed visitor center or the technical assistance center or the demonstration forest, and any projects that we've come up with, like a wood pellet manufacturing plant, for example. So I'm going to go through some of the vision and goals and the key revisions of this framework that we've gathered to date, because we have a lot of information so far to share. Some of the draft goals: conserve the forest while keeping the land in private ownership, support the private landowners to continue working their land, and support the financial health and the sustainability of the rural economies. More goals include increasing natural resource and tourism-based jobs and businesses, improving the infrastructure that supports the tourism in these businesses, providing options for the landowners who are interested in putting a conservation restriction on their property. We don't anticipate it's going to be a one-size-fits-all, that there are going to be options available depending on what you as a landowner need. And supporting local foresters that provide technical assistance to the property owners in Franklin and Berkshire County. So some of the highlights of this what we're calling this framework, or this kind of the bones of the federal designation. All 20 towns would be eligible to participate, but they would have to opt in order to receive the incentives and to allow the private landowners access to the funding for the conservation restrictions. The land stays in private ownership with state and federal payments to landowners for the conservation restrictions. It's willing sellers only, no eminent domain, and no federal right of first refusal. Those were two things that came out in previous, the two previous discussions about a traditional national forest that would be based on federal ownership of the land. And these were two important concerns that people wanted no part of. No eminent domain and no federal right of first refusal. Other elements of the framework: establishing a maximum amount of land that the U.S. Forest Service could own within the designation. A number that we've been working with so far is 1,000 to 2,000 acres. Creation of a notification process to the towns for new conservation restrictions on forested land funded by state agencies and/or the Forest Service. We've heard concerns that the towns are the last to know when a conservation restriction is going to be placed on a piece of property, and it, has potential tax implications. Requirement that the select board and/or the town meeting approve land conservation projects funded by the Forest Service if they result in land permanently protected above a maximum specified percentage. So, for example, towns that already have a lot of land in state ownership or owned by other entities, so permanently protected land, kind of what's that threshold, what's that tipping point? And this element is trying to get to that concern. Again, flexible conservation restrictions for the landowners that allow for working forests, habitat protection, and or passive recreation. And actually we have an update. A question was asked about, well, the snowmobile groups have a very well-maintained, very large network of trails on public and private property. And so the concern was, well, what if a landowner was going to have a conservation restriction put on their land, and they had, snowmobile trails on their land, and they wanted to continue that use, to continue to allow that to happen. And we've gotten some feedback that yes, that could continue to happen. So if you have a good relationship with the snowmobile club, and that would be written into the conservation restriction. So it's more than just passive, more than just like hiking or bird watching. The snowmobile is to be included as well. Conservation restrictions could be held by the state, towns, or local land trusts, and would be guided by existing state forestry regulations with no right of external appeals for timber harvesting. That point's been brought up at previous meetings. Well, can someone, in Mississippi or California or someplace else outside of Ashfield come and tell me that I can't log my land anymore? And the answer is no. Because of the way, the way this would be structured, no right of external appeals for timber harvesting would be allowed. This is not federally owned land. This is land in private ownership. It just has a layer of protection on it from development with the conservation restriction. Provision of tax incentives or technical assistance programs for sustainable forestry practices to provide private landowners and our local foresters with information and technical assistance that would hopefully be helpful. Provision of some reliable payment, not based on the pilot program or modeled like the pilot program, that would be funded by the state and or the U.S. foresters to participating towns to support those, to reimburse those costs, like for emergency services or road maintenance. Provision of incentives and funding to improve tourism infrastructure, trails, access roads, facilities, collaborative marketing of the region to help with economic development. And so this funding would be in addition to funding that's already currently available under existing state and federal programs, but it's funding that we currently do not have access to. So here's a timeline, and I'm going to talk in detail about a few of these things. So we are right here, town by town public information sessions, and so we're going to wrap those up in April and start working on the draft framework. There'll be another series of regional meetings once the draft plan is developed, and then the draft and the final plans will be presented to the select board in each of the towns. So at that point, the town select boards are going to have the opportunity to support the designation. And it may be that like a certain number of communities out of that 20 are needed to have this project move forward. We haven't been told what the number is, but there's only one town that's interested in it, it's probably not going to go anywhere. So this special legislation would be filed with the state to start this designation process. And again, there would be components in there that we've talked about so far potentially, but one of the jobs that we have is to kind of take all this input and craft a framework that would serve as a basis for the designation. If the state legislation is approved, then it goes up to the federal government and has to be approved as well. So, we've gotten to the questions that we have. Do people feel like they want to jump right into the questions, or if you need any info before we jump into questions, we can spend a little time to clarify maybe some of the aspects of the PowerPoint before we get to the questions, or do you just want to go right to the question? Go right to the questions?
Shall we give any chairs back to all you folks who are standing?
No, I'm fine.
All right.
Okay.
And turn up in front too.
Yeah, there are a bunch of chairs right here. All right, so these are the same list of questions that we've been asking all of the towns that we've visited. So, question number 1. What research, and it's okay to tell me, we don't really think this question applies to Ashfield. You know, we don't want to spend the time on something that there's really nothing to talk about. So what research, economic development, or technical assistance projects would benefit your community? Such as, for example, research and development for advanced wood products, pellet manufacturing facilities to support the use of local low-grade wood for heating to replace oil, and any other ideas? I want you to, you know, no idea is like too out there or outrageous, or because we're at the point in the process where everything, you know, can be on the table. So I don't want you to feel like there's some like constraints on these ideas. We want ideas. Should I time this when there's dead silence? Should I just move on?
We can always come back.
We can always come back, yes.
Once somebody breaks the ice.
Right.
What kind of technical assistance and money could be given to the community to support the improvement of wood-burning stoves and the efficiency of wood-burning stoves? Would that be a piece of it?
Potentially. Well, we'll write it down. And see, we don't necessarily have all the answers either, but part of our role in this process is to try to find the answers. So that's why having your contact information is so important, because as the framework is updated, and as this project evolves, we might get an answer to that question. Bob?
So I'm with the Environmental Affairs Office of the state, and our Department of Energy Resources currently has a wood stove buyback program to trade in your old wood stove for a new one that's cleaner and burning and more efficient. They had a program, I think, last year, and it was very popular. I think they spent about $1 million to replace hundreds of stoves, and it was so popular that they've just launched it again this winter. So if you're interested in that, come and see me afterwards. I can try to get you in touch with where to apply for that.
So they can also keep it on the table.
Oh yeah, it's a miracle that we've had 2 of these buybacks, but this would be a way to kind of say, we'd like that more.
Yeah. Great. Yes.
I've mentioned this at one of your other sessions, but a lot of our communities are joined by a regional school system, and it'd be, although the idea of additional conservation appeals to me, it'd be a shame just to have the National Forest Service show up with a big visitor center and 2,000 acres. I'd really like to see them put some skin in the game, come up with something like a pellet mill, and help our regional school system out with some pellet heating systems. We're still burning oil and propane, and that would be a nice shot in the arm in assistance to the local towns. So.
Our forests are going to drastically change in the next 20, 40, 60 years because of invasives and global warming. And I'm not sure everyone has a clue where we're going with this and what it means. One of the things I'm concerned about is these carbon stored in living forests that's going to suddenly be a lot of standing dead. It seems there's an area for research that would help landowners anticipate some of the changes that we're going to see in the loss of our major trees, major species. I'm talking about not just the beech, but the hemlocks, the maples, and of course, the ash.
So that raises for me the issue of education about what makes sense for future planting. Would there be additional educational resources for, what species would continue to maintain the framework of the forestry as climate warms?
Yeah.
I'm a little concerned about the emphasis on pellet. It requires electricity. I've never had it, but I believe it does, doesn't it? So that's not a particularly long-term sustainable thing, it seems to me. I believe they also come in huge plastic bags, so that I'm just curious why the pushing towards them. It seems throughout your presentation to be a major thing.
I just want to be clear that anything we've given as an example is just that. I don't want to give a perception that we're pushing one project over another. The pellet project is just something that has come up several times, so that's why it's included as an example. But hearing concerns that you might have about that is very helpful. So please don't think that we already have like this agenda that we're stuck with. It's more, in order to begin the conversation, we have to have kind of, some examples or kind of set the stage, so to speak.
Could I also just mention that there's copies of the framework on the back table, and there's a draft on a date stamp on it, and that's been changing as we're going along, so we're about to release a new framework based on additional information that or feedback we've been getting from people. So it's definitely kind of morphing as we go along. Some ideas seem like they're maybe falling a little bit more to the wayside, and other ideas are gaining more popularity. So nothing is a done deal at this point.
That's fine.
Just about the pellets, I'm not saying whether they're good or bad, but there's new furnaces that are very efficient. They're highly used in Europe, and the pellets are delivered in a truck that looks like an oil truck. In fact, Sandry Oil in Greenfield has a couple of these trucks and has been kind of testing out. The pellets are kind of blown into your hopper in the basement. It's just a big container, and then it self-loads into the furnace. So it's different than other wood heat in that it's pretty much as easy to use as oil, and it's 90% plus efficiency and clean burning. So it's a new technology that's kind of different than we've seen before.
And my understanding too, just based on the feedback that I've heard at the meetings, is that it's a market for the low-grade wood. Yes?
Just an observation, not all of the draft frameworks have the word draft printed on them.
Nice.
Yeah.
It should.
I think there's a stamp. Is it very pale?
No, not there at all. Still. It does say draft.
You know what speaking of trees, we were trying to save some by recycling some of the handouts from previous meetings. And so it may be that as long as the date on it, and the date should be January 31st.
Or January 30th.
Or 30th, but it's draft, trust me, it's draft.
If you have the one that doesn't say draft, you have like the actual real one.
But it is a draft. Are there any other ideas about question number one? Yes.
Yeah, so high-grade wood, virtually all leaves the state. So in terms of economic development at the federal level, we need to do something about the unfair competition from Canadian sawmills, which is where most of our wood goes.
And we've heard that concern expressed at other meetings. We need a way to have a local market for the high grade. Anything else on one? Yes.
I don't know if this necessarily pertains to one, but it pertains to the project.
Okay.
What concerns me is what it's going to be doing to our open space. Ashfield is rather unique in the fact that we still do have some open space. However, every year it becomes smaller and smaller. And I think a project like this would certainly do away with a good percentage of our open space. And this, maybe it's because of the change of people. We like to hunt, we like to fish, we like to trap, and do these things that you sort of do in what we call open space.
Yeah.
And we might not have this open space very much longer if we get into this position. It's a concern.
Yeah. Yes.
Doug, are you talking about open space as open fields and pasture?
No, 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 no.
Okay.
It's land that is not inhabited.
I don't know, Wendy, did you want to say anything to that?
Well, land that has a conservation restriction on it could still be hunted and fished just as it is today.
That's good.
Okay. We want to move on to number 2. What type of financial assistance does your community need to address potential impacts on municipal services from the designation? So we've heard from some towns that we're not interested in having, the visitor center, for example. We're not interested in hosting a technical resource center. We are interested maybe in having part of our state forest leased or owned by the federal government. So this question goes to, if you did have if part of the town was owned by or leased by the Forest Service for one of these facilities, what potential impacts on the municipal services would there be? And how would you be reimbursed for that? Yes.
Municipal services, does that mean like firefighting? Well, they're doing a wonderful job with the ones out west. They burn 1 million acres before they can even slow them down. We've got bombs and missiles that can destroy thousands of miles, but they can't stop a forest fire in West Forest Street. That's a little suspicious to me.
Well, this would be something like if there was a demonstration forest in Ashfield, and there were trails, and somebody got hurt, and they called 911, and the town had costs associated with that, and the town did some road maintenance. In a lot of ways, this question is kind of like, yeah, we need some money, we need to be reimbursed for any cost to the town. But I think specifically we were looking for, people had ideas or examples of the types of municipal services that might be called on. Yeah.
Fighting a fire out into the woods or getting emergency services out into the woods are very different than going to someone's house. So what communities might need are some mobility, for instance, an ATV that could be driven out with a stretcher on it so somebody can be brought back without having to be carried, or a smaller vehicle with a water tank on it with a pumper that can be driven out where a larger truck can't go, and increased training for the first responders, fire and police and ambulance on what's different about rescues and fighting, disasters in those areas. We've had forest fires and, we've managed to get them out, but it's a very different kind of action than the stuff we're used to. You're
very good with brush fires. If they get into the trees, it's a different situation. So maybe specialized equipment or specialized training would be helpful.
Yeah.
Raises a question for me. I'm not sure if this is the time to raise it, but if a community opts in, and then an area of 1,000 acres or so is identified as a potential demonstration forest, can the town or the landowner opt not to do that? Or does, once the town opts in, is the potential for establishing some kind of demonstration forest or visitor center mandated?
That's a good question. Our understanding that the land would only be acquired from a willing seller. So, and if the town had made it clear that they didn't want these things, or they just wanted the visitor center but no demonstration for it, these are the types of things that we need to hear. Where are the escape hatches in the process? So I mentioned earlier, that the towns want to be able, once the legislation goes to the state and goes through the sausage grinder of the state legislative process, what comes out the other end? Is the town still happy with it? Well, there's an escape hatch potentially. Hey, this isn't what we sent to you. We don't like it. We don't want to opt. We don't want to participate anymore. So, making sure that we identify those areas where the towns are able to say, no, this is not what we signed on, is really important. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, it's not that I have any objections with one or the other, but I just want to know at what point do our hands get tied if they do.
So maybe we can just, I can't read what you wrote, but
It's there.
okay.
And I think what we've also been hearing is that there are some towns who really are interested in the idea of, say, a visitor center, and then there's other towns who say, no way. So, and that's, I think, we think that that's where the conversation ends with that. And if the town isn't interested, then we would be forced to the common.
Yeah.
Talking about opting out after the legislation, I assume that if the town reflected their interest in the process, and then they found out that there wasn't really much that was going to be happening, like the fire department wasn't going to be beefed up, or the school systems weren't going to be supported, or in fact, they haven't allocated any money to additional CR purposes. A lot of details in there that I'm really, really concerned about, that I want to know they're committed to. And not just to have us say yes and have a visitor center show up in some neighboring town with no muscle behind it. So I really want to understand the details from the Forest Service coming back. How's it going to change things here? It's really, really important. It's not just legislation, it's commitment to funding and so on and so forth. How different from the CRs that are being obtained in the neighboring towns now is it going to be? Is it going to be a doubling? Is it going to be a tripling? And so on and so forth. So I want some hard answers coming back. That's really important, not just legislation.
Two questions. One is, and maybe it doesn't have a good answer. What is a demonstration forest?
Well, Bob, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think it could be whatever people are interested in seeing. The Forest Service has several research forests. There's one in Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire, part of the White Mountain National Forest, where they've done really internationally groundbreaking research on watersheds and how water goes through a forest and how it protects reservoirs. And if you just Google Hubbard Brook, you'll find like decades of research. So it could be, how private landowners manage their land and what kind of impacts people have raised, like climate change. That would be probably an obvious thing to study, is like how is our forest starting to change, and what species are. I think we're hearing, the oaks are going to be moving in and the hardwoods are going to be kind of slowly phasing out over time if climate change continues like that. But they could study that and kind of see, with all the invasive species that are coming in, the ash problem, the hemlock woolly dulges, they could study that. But I think it would be geared towards answers to questions that would help landowners manage their forests better. There could be some recreation on the forest, and it could also be a place where certain different types of forest practices that might benefit certain wildlife, or that might show how low-grade products could be harvested, or how to get the best high-grade, where you might market it. There's a wide range of things that it could be, and I think it would be, once a town is interested in that or whatever, then we could sit down and work with the Forest Service researchers and foresters to I think Kimberly has said this is not a national forest. The national forest has probably hundreds of foresters that have a lot of experience, and maybe they could be like a forester in residence at this research station to help out. So there's like the sky's the limit, I think, if we're creative, and I'm starting to see other examples around the country of very innovative things that they've done. From the research station they established in New York City to the kind of the cooperative project that they have after 10 years in New Mexico to reduce the fire load, and kind of in concert with the environmental groups that have been opposing logging. Very innovative things that are kind of outside of the national forest.
Harvard Forest is another example.
Yeah. I mean, we're lucky to have Harvard Forest, and that could be kind of a boost. I mean, we could have researchers from Harvard Forest come to the Ashfield demonstration forest to help out.
So why would that be different than what's going on now?
Well, I mean, Harvard Forest has got a very focused on what they're doing, which is kind of land use history and things. This could be a whole different goal as to what would be researched or demonstrated. If you went to Harvard Forest, you wouldn't see demonstrations of how to manage your woodlot, I don't think. There are some cuttings going on there, but they're usually focused on whatever research project that they're doing.
Yes.
There is state and federal money available now for foresters to help out with people and local people right now without this.
I don't know, Bob, did you?
Yeah, I mean, the forest stewardship plans that have been funded, that's state funding. This DCR has funded over 1,000 forest stewardship plans across the state at a cost of like $1.4 million over the last 5 years. It's just been a great thing. I mean, the average amount of forestry that happens under these plans is like 2.5 times the average. So we know that forestry results when people sit down with a private forester and work out a plan. There is some Forest Service money, but it's very, very competitive. I mean, Wendy and I have applied for grants and we didn't get them. We try again. We did have a grant for demonstrating buy local, how to get local products sold locally. That was a $500,000 project that the Forest Service funded a few years ago. It's just winding down now. But it created that Commonwealth Quality Program that our Department of Agriculture has, that there's 10 or 15 sawmills and wood products companies that have joined to prove that they're selling Massachusetts-grown sustainable forest products. So I think there's one right in Ashfield. So there are some benefits, but the point of this is, if we're the national model for how to demonstrate working with private forests, we're more likely to get a steady stream of funding to help.
And, funding does go in cycles, so if the funding right now for what you're describing is flush or has been for a couple of cycles, it might not be, in the future. And if we had access to federal money to supplement that, and then again, when the federal money dries up and the state funding, rises. So just having that access, that potential access to the funding could be helpful. And the purpose wouldn't be to supplant the good work that's already being done and already funded by the state, but to just help that the process when it was needed. Yes.
But like you said, some of these programs are already available. And you're saying in order to get this, you have to give up your conservation rights for the life of the land. I mean, not just 10 years, forever. And you're saying that, and the advantages are the same advantages you can get through Chapter 61. So do you really want to give up the rights to your land for the rest of its life in order to potentially get some benefits from the feds that we can get already from the state and local?
I don't know if it's clear, but any landowner that decides that they want to sell a conservation restriction on their land would be paid the value that has in the loss of development value. So it's up to the landowner whether they think that's a
But
fair
Chapter
price.
61, right now, if you want to keep the land, it's the same benefit, unless you're saying the benefit from this, you said is the same as Chapter 61, are you getting double the tax benefits, or are you in the same place?
You would be paid for the value of your development value. So, it would be, where we did a project like this in the North Quabbin, a state-funded project many years ago, with the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, we purchased 100 conservation restrictions on 10,000 acres around the 4 towns north of Quabbin, all from landowners that were interested in doing that. And they were paid for the value that they gave up, but they continued to do forestry. And one landowner, we had a lot of workshops to kind of explain what is a conservation restriction. I remember one landowner who had sold a conservation restriction said, I sold the value of my land, but I still own it. So it's kind of Wendy could explain more what a conservation restriction is, but you still have the right to do forestry, you own the land, you sell the land, but you're paid the value that you would have gotten for development that you're not going to do.
And if you're not, and if you aren't interested in it, there's no one would compel you, to do it. It would be your choice. Even if the town opted in to the designation, it just presents an opportunity for the landowner. You as a landowner would not have to participate.
This week. Well, the stroke of a pen would change all that. And I don't buy that it couldn't happen. I think it could. And again, I'm a little leery of it.
Yeah. So how would you, so the question would be, how could you safeguard against that? Or you feel there's no
I think
safeguard?
things the way they are. Everything seems to be going along the way we're going.
Well, let me just call on someone that hasn't spoken yet. Yes.
Question for you. You mentioned manufacturing wood pellets. You mentioned service sector and industry jobs. Is there anything in there, any template for coexistence with any type of manufacturing other than wood pellets? Any type of hard manufacturing? The analogy I give you is somebody with a garage who buys an injection molder. Is there anything in here that prevents somebody from establishing a new small mill and providing working jobs? Anything in here that prevents somebody not participating in this program from establishing that?
So if I understand your question, if we didn't do this project, could someone put in a wood pellet manufacturing
No.
facility?
What I'm saying is this. If you have a landowner that says, I'm not participating in this,
Right.
but they want to establish, they want to buy they want to buy a plastics injection molding machine, put it in the garage and start making parts. What's in here to prevent them from doing that on their property, provided they meet all the other regulatory requirements? Is there anything here that will prevent them from doing that on their property with their land?
I don't think so. No.
Is there anything in here that deals with any other type, any coexisting with any other type of manufacturing other than, say, wood pellets in the economy?
So, are you concerned that the projects that would be done under this designation would be exclusive or somehow harm other ventures?
I'm just curious as to if there is any prescription against anything else. There doesn't appear to be.
No. I'm sorry, I'm
okay.
struggling with that. Yes.
One of the early slides said that there would be no decrease in, I think it even said an increase in local tax revenues. Well, where do those tax revenues come from? What is the increase in value that causes taxes to go up?
It was in relation to Chapter 61, so it wouldn't go up from full fair market value, but with a concentration on it, the numbers suggest that the property would still be taxed at either 61 values or perhaps higher than 61 values, as some conservation restricted land in Ashfield currently is.
If you're participating in 61 or one of those sections now, and you add conservation restrictions, there's no reason to believe taxes would go up, would it?
If you had a conservation restriction on your land but weren't in 61, so a lot of towns use those numbers as the same and interchange 61 values for kind of undevelopable conservation restricted land. But that isn't necessarily, that's not a law, no tax required to actually do that. So it's the town's choice, they could actually tax that land, that restricted land, at higher than 61 values.
But if you still had 61 on the land,
Then
it would stay at that lower rate. But sometimes landowners don't want to keep the 61 status up, particularly for forestry. Once they have a conservation restriction, it's just more work.
The study that we did was all the parcels are now in the computer mapping thing. We looked at the average tax payments for land under Chapter 61 in each town, for land that had a conservation restriction, like Ashfield has several of those. And then we just looked at regular land, and pretty much in every town, the kind of land that was in no program was taxed the highest. The land that had a conservation restriction but wasn't in Chapter 61 was taxed the next lowest, and then the lowest was Chapter 61. If we were successful in getting some wood-based manufacturing or plants, then that could help the tax base for a town to have that. If you had we keep saying a pellet plant, it could be anything, a garage injection. The Forest Products Lab in Wisconsin that would be a resource for this is figuring out a way to make wood into plastic for car bumpers. Because if you think about it, wood is made out of carbon, so is oil, which makes plastic. So whatever it might be, that manufacturing plant would be help to a town's tax.
Yes. What I remember that the slide said was that if you take a conservation restriction, your Chapter 61 tax benefit could go away. That's what it says on the slide. It can go, your taxes can go up. And so, I mean, it seems like you're trading one thing for another. Yeah.
Can you not have both a conservation restriction and 61 designation? Yes. Yeah.
But it's up to you whether you stay in Chapter 61 or not, and the CR would have no impact on that. You could stay in Chapter 61 and keep that the lowest of the taxes, or we could, it wouldn't change it.
So this slide is coming out from the municipal perspective, which is tax revenue.
That's a good point, though. It is confusing whether you're looking at it from the town's point of view or the
The landowner has a choice. He can take a CR, or he can keep Chapter 61. Is that what you're saying?
Or you can do both.
That's not what that says, I don't
Who
think.
decides the tax then? The tax rate? If they do both, the county.
Then 61 would trump the CR. 61 is as low as it goes.
And I think like Wendy said, the slide was put together thinking from a town's standpoint, so that if the land only had the CR, there would be, slightly more revenue that was going through the town versus land that just had Chapter 61. But we can clarify that slide. From a landowner's perspective, the best situation would be to have, potentially would be to have the CR and have it enrolled in Chapter 61 for the lowest taxes, right?
And the payment for the value of the CR in addition to the tax.
Right. Yes?
To be clear, my kids just built on my land, and we took their 2-acre parcel out of 61, paid back taxes on it. It was all for the best. But that would not be possible to make that decision down the road with this conservation restriction. Is that true?
It would be possible if you kept the building envelopes, or you designated potential areas where you might have a house lot or 2 or 3 as part of the conservation restriction.
But it's a one-way door, basically.
I see somebody back there that, I'll come back to you, I promise. Yes.
Just wondering, you talk about the CR, everything's coming down to dollars and cents. Like the dealing with the problem, what was your average price per acre for land for what you sold there? And also in the second part of that, could you put a conservation restriction on APR land?
I missed the first half of your question. It was, what's the dollar?
Right.
For the CRs around the bobbin?
Yeah. Or say I got 500 acres, what would I be looking at to put in a conservation restriction? How much money?
So it all depends on basically how developable your land is now. So an appraiser comes out and does an appraisal of your full development value, essentially a build out. How many house lots can I get on your land? And that equals, say, $1 million. And then he comes out and says, what is this worth without those lots? Forestry, agriculture. And the difference is the value of your conservation restriction. All those house lots, they're then eliminated by the conservation restriction, unless you choose to keep them out as a building envelope. And so that's the dollar that the federal government would pay you. So say that's $600,000. Then your $1 million parcel is reduced to $400,000 and taxed essentially at that $400,000 level.
Does this end up being a bidding process? Because you talked about 1,000 to 2,000 acres. Say I got 500, the next guy next to me has 500. It could be done, it's just like it would Stoughton, it had to be done in a week's time.
Oh, the 1 to 2,000 acres, that number applies to the land that the Forest Service or the federal government would own outright. So there hasn't been a discussion about acreage caps on land that a CR would be funded.
But it would be
that wasn't clear. Yeah, so we need to.
The point of the CR program would be the average landowner who's interested in looking into this to look into this. Whereas right now, if you own 75 acres in Ashfield, you probably won't have one of our state agencies, calling you up asking if you want to sell a CR. You definitely won't have the Forest Service funding anything. There is a program called Forest Legacy that they fund like one project, if we're lucky, every year or two, somewhere in the state. But it's usually a big piece of land. So this program would be more like, how do we take average forest land owned by average people and work on kind of really making a good economy and a good conservation outcome.
And just real quickly, the second part of your question, if you already have an APR on your land, then you've already removed those development values from your land, so you wouldn't be able to put a conservation restriction on it, because you've already been paid for those house lots, essentially.
Just thought I'd try.
Yeah.
They're the same thing, really.
Yes.
It is different, but they're both by the development value.
Do you envision the CR money coming out of the LWCF,
Out of the what?
Land and Water Conservation Fund?
Yes.
I didn't catch that question.
Oh, do we envision the money coming from the Land and Water Conservation Fund? And Wendy's answer is?
There's a fund that collects hundreds of millions of dollars every year from offshore oil leases that the federal government owns, and from a 1960s law, it goes into a fund that the majority of it funds federal agencies to do things like this, and then some of it goes to states for grants.
And it hasn't been fully funded since it was established.
No, but the federal government side is bigger than the state side, and we don't get into that. So this would open up a new world to us at times.
Yes.
Can you speak to the previous question about what's different in what the land trust provides to property owners who want a restriction this new arrangement? I mean, why not just go with the land trust's very proven and stewardly approach?
Thank you. For one. Well, and the main reason is funding, because right now we have funding for, special habitat lands or for, very special farmland with productive soils. But we have no funding for kind of your average wood parcel. So this would be what we're thinking of as sort of a working woodlands APR program.
That's my question that I want to ask is, it seems like it is exactly that. Are there differences between, we have APR land here in Ashfield, and if there's farmland that's coming up to be reviewed for APR, if it's adjacent to other APR land, that really increases its likelihood for being approved for that. What are the differences between this on forest land and APR for ag land?
Or what are the criteria, are there any criteria that have been set for what land could be in?
Right, we haven't set criteria for how funding would be prioritized. I would imagine that would be something that the Forest Service would be part of since they're funding. But we are working on a draft conservation restriction, which would be based on the forest legacy CRs that are very much about active forest management that also use Forest Service funding.
And are there differences in terms of opportunities or restrictions between an APR and what this would be for forest land?
There's certain provisions in APRs that land must continue to be actively farmed, and there would be no provisions like that.
It doesn't have to continue to be actively
managed. Bob, do you have anything to add to that? Any differences
I think we would encourage good forestry, and the CR would be open to, good forestry, with the standards that Chapter 61 provides. But if the current landowner says, here's what I want to do, it's your land. But if you do forestry, you'd have to do them with good standards like Chapter 61. And we'd have technical assistance to, let people know all the benefits of doing good forestry.
Yeah.
If I understand right, the way things are now, Wendy, it's really heavily loaded on the gifting side. So a lot of CRs come because people can gift the development value of their land and then take it off of their income tax, apply it to their income tax over so many years. From what I understand, this will allow for the outright purchase of those, cash in hand. Isn't that the idea of this? Isn't it a major difference in this plan versus the current plan?
Yep.
Okay. So.
And I think we need to make that point more clear. That is the major use of the funding here, and that we don't currently have. Yes.
You said that there would have to be a certain percentage of towns participating in this program for it to be implemented by the federal government. If a town votes, I assume it would be a majority vote to participate, maybe a select board vote, but in either case, if it is voted in, is there a minimum participation level of landowners in terms of acreage or owners? Is there going to be any social pressure to acquiesce to these new rules if the town participates?
Those are great questions. We'll find
I would say the answer is no, this is all up to the landowner. I mean, our gut feeling is within these 20 towns, if we're lucky to get pretty good funding, we probably would have more people interested in this than funding. So, if you don't want to do it, there's no pressure. There'd be other people that probably want to do it. I mean, the Tully example, the 4 towns north of Quabbin, was totally voluntary. 20 or 30 landowners right off the bat said, I want to do this, I understand. A lot of people, as I think it's complicated to understand this, but once those 20 people kind of came to the workshops and said, here's what it was from their perspective as landowners, we ended up getting 100 people that wanted to do it. So, and it was all up to them, and they decided to do it. There's a lot more landowners that decided not to do it. And it's up to them.
The CRs, as I understand it, I have a CR land in Ashfield, and one of the reasons that we put in place was to make sure that certain forms of development did not happen, certain things did not take place on land. And that I understand that it requires a two-thirds vote of the state legislature to change that designation. Would these CRs have that same formula, given that they're held by the Reservoir Service?
They're not going to be held that close.
Right. Yeah, they're going to be held by the state, land trust, or towns. But it's still a,
Similar to the situation that you have now.
So who gets to write the rules?
Well, I mean, we have about 100 forest legacy easements in the state already, and it's kind of like with an APR. The federal government helps fund the APRs, and they have a say in kind of the language that's in there. They have a template, just like the Forest Service has. But it's just something else that a landowner has a concern, and it's worked out. And if they can't work it out, then it's up to the landowner, to decide what to do. But 100 landowners or so have gone through the Forest Legacy program in other parts of the state and have worked out the language. There's a lot of bureaucracy in government, but at the end of the day, everybody works for the government, whether it be federal or state, is trying to do the right thing and serve the public, who we serve.
Well, let's assume that the government has ideas about establishing certain, well, let's talk about a pipeline. Would there be any, would it be easier, because there's not this two-thirds state legislature clause, for a Forest Service, which is associated with the federal government, to implement such a thing?
so I think what I heard Bob say is that it would be a similar situation where the state, it would require a two-thirds vote of the state legislature. But, we can get clarity on that, this is something that people are comfortable with as a protection. They don't want to see that go away. Is that? I don't know who's well on the question. On our list, but we're getting some good feedback. Yeah.
You kind of skipped item 3.
Oh, I can go back.
Discussed earlier.
Thank you.
But
Technical assistance.
I think assistance on controlling invasive species has got to be one of the most important things you can do. Hemlocks, beeches, ashes, all, and sooner or later the longhorn Asian beetle's going to get here. So maples are all threatened, and that would be a key role. The University of Massachusetts is already doing that. This designation could up the funding for UMass's biocontrol labs. That would be a key feature.
Great. Are there any other comments about the technical assistance?
Another area of research that I hope we get into is the question of carbon storage in forest biota and forest soils, and reward or compensation for that benefit, protection of that benefit, understanding of that benefit.
Wow, we've gone through 3. Okay. Let's see. Are there any areas in town that you consider priorities for forest conservation? This is a question that might take a little, thought and investigation, but if you...
We should mention, that people should have those handouts, and if you don't, make sure you take one, or I can hand them out too, but there's a small map on the back side of those questions, and you can mark areas if you'd like.
And thank you, Mary. And all the questions that we were hoping to go through and may not get to are on the back of that handout. So you're welcome to jot down any thoughts you have about the questions as well, and return those forms.
So they're all used up. So if you would make sure that you put a check mark next to your name on the sign-in sheet. If you haven't gotten one, then we'll make sure that we email or mail you one.
Can someone hold one up so that folks see what it?
Is this what we're talking about?
No, that's what we're talking about.
Oh, it's a pretty map.
Yes. So if you didn't get one and you want one, put a star next to your name, please.
One point about these maps, though,
Yes.
is that one homeowner here has several different parcels of land in town, and not any of them are colored the right color.
Isn't that hard to believe?
In terms of whether you're in chapter 61 or, yeah. You know, the chapter data is like a moving target. It changes every year, and sometimes our data lags behind it. So if you notice a problem like that, you can mark it up and send it back to us, and we'll update the data that we have for Ashfield.
Is that a draft or is that a real one?
Well, that's draft.
Says draft.
And like I said, it's based on the data that we have. So for example, you know, we got data from the land trust, we got data from the state,
And from the town.
and from the town.
Recently, that doesn't mean that it's all up to date.
Right, and I wouldn't stake my life on that every single color on that map is correct. If you see a problem, we want to know, please. Yes.
Priority, not to specific locations, but it would seem to me that a set of contiguous properties which would allow a corridor of undeveloped land would be important for migration and also recreation. You know, you could, people want to put trails, but primarily for migrations of wildlife that you don't necessarily want them in your backyard, and they would benefit by being able to get from the DAR to Holy State Forest without having to run into development along the way.
Including road crossings.
I intend to migrate.
So number 5, what projects do you think can help with the sale of local wood products that are based on a sustainable forestry industry in Franklin County? Yes.
This is kind of a combination of 4 and 5. We're looking at priorities. Well, I've lived next to Holly State Forest all my life, and I've never seen anything so disgusting in my life. To see how that has changed from what it was 40 years ago to what it is now. It's absolutely disgusting. You can't cut any lumber on it, the road you can't pass. If you wanted to show us what you were going to do, you'd move right in there to clean the roads up, make the forest better so people could go in there and log it. There is a center over there. If you came in there and refurbished that, then maybe people will believe what you're doing. But if you don't, we've seen it, and the state owns it. Here's the perfect case for the federal to come in and say, okay, I'm going to work with the state, we're going to clean this place up.
Any other ideas?
Yeah, if states and local governments would buy local wood, it would make an enormous impact on the sale of wood.
I think we need a better understanding of what is happening to mills that are here. What we can do to reverse that. There was a very large one in Amherst where the Coles is. They had a fire, they replaced it, and then they closed it down after. What can you do to help them or any other mill remain in business? Certainly mandating that local products be purchased by localities, would help. But, being able to try to identify, do a feasibility feasibility study on what could be successful. But the other thing is to also understand why some of the other ventures weren't successful. Both.
I think one of these is taking land by eminent domain and not allowing these wood producers to cut lumber.
Right, and this designation, this model for this new federal designation would not have any eminent domain. That would not happen.
Ma'am,
Yes.
I'm very skeptical of that statement, and the reason was in the paper just the other day. We were told that the state could say no to the gas line and the federal government could mandate it be taken. So I'm very leery of such a restriction working.
Relative to 4 and 5 there, I'd say do what you can to get our school system off of fossil fuels would be a really good start. Yeah, it's about $500,000 worth of propane and oil that's coming from far away. Fossil fuel is just dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. And whether it's wood chips, like a lot of school systems in Vermont have, or pellets, I'll leave it up to the experts to determine which is the best way. But I think you're supporting a local economy by doing that, and you're taking in some environmental concern too. That's how you really push the local economy. That's how new chippers come into the area, and you put money in the pockets of the loggers that are local to your area, because otherwise you're transporting wood chips from far away, and it's very expensive to do that. So that's how you really help your area.
I wonder if there could be more help with individuals who want to have just local portable mills, thinking about this and other bigger mills are facing, that there could be more individual folks who come on that they have on our property and mill some of the logs and taking in some trees and taking down. In terms of priorities for forest conservation, I don't have a copy of that, but I'm looking over Tom's shoulder here, thinking that where there are forest lands that overlap with other conservation interests like the bio corridors, really makes a lot of sense to compound the conservation down here.
Visitor center will cure all that.
Number 6, if designation proceeded, would your community be interested in hosting the land owned by the Forest Service, either the administration forest, the visitor center, or technical assistance? I heard a no.
The largest landowner in town is 300 or so acres, 300, 400 acres. So that would be unique, contiguous selling out by a dozen homeowners for you to get 1,000 acres.
It doesn't have to be contiguous.
Look for the demonstration forest and the visitor
Well,
center?
maybe for the, well, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't, they're not saying to us that the land owned by the Forest Service has to be contiguous. It could be kind of a patchwork, the visitor center here, technical resource center here, demonstration forest here.
Well, for number 7, if that is the option, there are some large tracts, so there are state parks that would be co-designated.
Right. Yeah, that idea has come up before. So I heard a no, and I heard maybe a maybe if it was, if they came and acquired a portion of existing state forest, yes.
Always been the policy of the National Forest to consolidate their forest. If there's an inside ownership, they'll trade that person for land that's on the outside edge of the forest. This is very foreign to National Forest policy. I don't see anything here from the U.S. Forest Service that has their vision. What is their vision of this? Where is their promise for funding? It's not here. I mean, that's what we need to see. I mean, I'd like to see something from the Forest Service.
And we've heard that request too, and we're, Bob has been working on that. Did you hear that?
Yes, the Forest Service is very interested in this idea, and they're looking at kind of having a liaison person from the Forest Service be able to come to some of these meetings, probably the regional meetings once the town meetings are done, to kind of give their view on how this could work. Because, I mean, I don't work for the Forest Service, so I don't know, and I think that's a good point.
But we are trying to get someone from the Forest Service here to...
Not just to come and talk, but to put something on paper, on paper.
And I will move on.
Well, let's make sure we're done with number 6. So if the designation proceeded, would the community be interested in hosting in any way? We heard one no.
Many no's.
Well,
Well, and you can change your mind. We're just trying to gauge the issues right now.
I think we'll certainly find very little enthusiasm for the idea.
What are the tax implications for that land?
That would be owned by the federal government. Well, going back to, would this go back to this idea of a system that's kind of like a pilot but not a pilot?
Yeah, I think if the Forest Service actually did own some land, there's, I'm not saying it's the greatest thing in the world, but they do make payments on the land. So if a town was interested, then they'd have to kind of like figure it out. Kimberly had also mentioned that some people were kind of objecting to the idea of a federal footprint. So it could be like they have some field stations where they lease land from the local community or whatever and pay for the maintenance of the facility, and just, that's where they work. So there's other ways to work around this. But I think initially people thought maybe people, and in other towns like Charlemont, they had 3 or 4 places where they said, yeah, that's a good place for a visitor center. We have 2 inns that are closed. We'd like to see them, get some good use.
Given the comment was made about the poor management of some state forests, it seems like that's, if there were to be that kind of demonstration forest, that might be a way of solving a problem and having even better forest management.
So you're saying the feds take ownership of the state?
I don't
Partnership or lead.
I would be interested in learning more about that, but I think that would be, if there was an appropriate place for that, that would be.
What about Alan's suggestion? I hate to offer another town's land, but what about Holly? I mean, how many acres is the forest up there?
I'm going to say you have 2,000 acres.
It's got to be 2,000 acres. It's
And you put
huge.
that in Savoy, Charlemont.
I mean, talk about breathing some life into into a place and sending a very positive message. Makes sense.
Well, you're not sending it now.
Exactly.
So have we covered 6 and 7? Because we just talked about the state forest. Where would possible locations be for a demonstration forest or a visitor center? Well, Holly's came forward, Howard was mentioned. Didn't hear any interest about a visitor center in Ashfield. Yes.
I'm just curious, besides just the emphasis on wood, why such an emphasis on tourism? Every analysis I've ever looked at, it's a very bad economic base. It's not recession-proof. It's the first thing people ditch when they're low on cash. Why the push for that?
Well, again, we're not pushing one thing or another. This was because your concern has been voiced at another meeting that I facilitated. However, there, like the town of Charlemont, for example, is very interested in tourism and how this designation could breathe some life back into their local economy. So, yeah, tourism might be off the list for Ashfield. It's not a concern, and that's fine. But other towns, remember there are 20 towns in this potential designation. And the first of the Berkshire County meetings are being held this week, and so they might have different opinions about how important tourism is for their region. But we're hearing that it's not really at the top of the list for some of our Franklin County towns, for the reasons you articulated.
And I would just add that, for a town like Buffalo, we think it might be that we heard both things from people at that meeting. Some of them didn't want to rely on tourism, that they felt that was an unstable thing to rely on. So we have heard that before, even for towns who do have quite a bit of tourism. Yes.
The meeting in Athens this week, they have the Greylock blend, which has been going on for decades, and if this could kind of help bring that to the finish line and get it going, they would love. That's so there's lots of different perspectives in the different towns.
I think of all the towns in this area that are being asked to participate, Buckland perhaps and Shelburne College are the most. Their economy is based on tourism predominantly. And you end up only being able to buy a pair of eyeglasses or go and get a meal to eat in such a town. And I think we have to, the rest of us perhaps have to go in other ways rather than tourism.
Yes.
I'm just curious what a visitor center would do if there wasn't a demonstration forest in the same town.
So if forestry became the theme for this designation, it could be a place where they demonstrate local wood products, that they are technical, they have like experts in marketing and the new technologies that could help the wood industry in the local area. So, it might not be kind of like learn about nature visitor center. It would be more like how forests and forestry, can provide goods for local communities. So it would be a different kind of thing.
Yes.
I just suggest a little possible consideration of an underutilized school building in this 9-town district. Many of the forests you're talking about are in these towns. We have a big school down at the bottom of the hill that burns $500,000 of fossil fuel, as we heard earlier. Might be a synergy there between fuel conversion, visitor center, education, retraining of some of the kids there.
Did you get all that, Mary?
I didn't.
There was a lot of there. Yeah. Can you repeat that?
Pick up the phone and call Mohawk.
He was saying that there was some synergy between, the school that burns the fossil fuel, getting them off of that, using the local wood products, teaching the kids to. And their space. Oh, okay, and their space. So you can't repeat what you said? So she can get it down, or did we get it?
I think you got it.
Okay.
We have vocational schools now that serve our towns that are starting to be invested in by the industries that need the people that graduate from those schools, and they're putting equipment in there to train them. We could do some of that at Mohawk with forestry. We could convert our school system down there and demonstrate that, and it is right off Route 2. It could potentially be a visitor center. I'm sure there's some conflict between security and whatnot, but that stuff can be addressed. So.
It's a great idea. Yes.
I think about this whole thing being sponsored by U.S. Forest Service, all well and good. But this year in particular, they're talking about the vegetable sources of this entire country. 40% of American vegetables are coming from an extreme or exceptional drought area, and they may not be available. Ashfield used to be a much greater agricultural center than it used to be before. Do you think this program would in some ways discourage the conversion of land from forest to food production? Because it's a forestry program and they don't really go for conversion or cutting down their forests to do other things with it. And it seems like it could be detrimental to that growth, that potential growth.
There was some discussion about kind of the, a transition being built into the CR, that, activities could change over time from, so I don't know if you could have the potential to change from Yeah, logging to add.
Especially as formerly ag land.
I think that's a really good point, that we try to make clear in SCR that conversion from forest land to agricultural land would be allowed.
Yes, there's a whole hipster and industry called foraging. You can use place in forests.
Right.
I would be hungry.
So, the last question, did we cover 8 and 9?
Sure.
Yep. The last question, what is your level of interest in proceeding with this process?
Secret ballot.
Well, that's in part what those
You might be
papers
shot,
are
Dave.
for. And you can find us by phone or email, so you don't feel comfortable saying, you know, this is, I definitely don't want this, or I definitely support it. You know, you can let us know other ways as well.
Who is we? Who is behind this? Who is paying for this?
Well, when I'm
Is it
saying,
the state or is the Forest Service paying for this?
sir, when I'm saying we, I'm just saying we as the FRCOG taking public input, that's the we that I'm talking about.
Who's paying you to do
Okay.
this?
The Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs awarded a grant jointly to the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, and the Franklin Land Trust to conduct the community outreach that we're doing now, and to gather all the input we received from both the regional meetings and the community meetings, and put together that plan, the slide that I showed earlier in the presentation that has the goals, the, let me go back to it. You know, the vision.
I see all this. I'm just trying to figure out why people are doing this. You are all doing this. Why isn't the Forest Service here? Why isn't the state representative here to talk why we should do this?
Well, there is a state representative sitting right behind you. That's Bob
He's
O'Connor.
not from the Forest Service.
No, he's not from the Forest Service.
He cannot give their answers. There's a lot of answers that we need from the Forest Service, what they're going to expect from whoever joins this program.
Yeah, and we
In
are.
writing forever.
Yeah.
It's not going to change with someone's signature.
And we're working to get somebody, a representative from the Forest Service to come here and answer some of these
When
questions.
is that going to happen? All I see is you're going to call the town, well, council here, essentially, not back to us.
Well, right, the regional meeting that will be held will be another opportunity for you to
Well, where will that be
weigh in.
held? Will it be held when we have to quit or work early to go and get there?
The last meeting was held in Shelburne, from 6 to 8 at the Shelburne Buckland.
Well, that's the regional one. Where's the regional one going to be?
Probably, you know, in a similar place in Shelburne. There's going to be one regional one held in Franklin County and one in Berkshire County.
So it's going to be out here, not in Boston.
Right. Yeah, and then the draft of the plan, the framework, if you will be presented to the select board in each of the towns. So that's another opportunity for you as a resident of Ashfield to come and participate in that meeting as well. Yeah, so make sure we have your email so we can, you can receive notices about the upcoming meetings, and as the framework evolves, you can receive drafts of those. And if you didn't get one of the maps or any of the other information out there, we'd be happy to send it to you. And so once we have someone from the Forest Service that is scheduled to come, talk to us, talk to the towns, we'll also let you know about that as well.
And that will be before the select board meeting.
We're hoping, you know, Bob's been working on this, so we're hoping to.
I'll do us much help to have them here after it.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But what if there's a whole bunch of people that want to do this, and there's no money? All of a sudden, they're going to cherry pick the ones they want? Who's going to do that?
You mean in terms of who gets the money for the
Yes,
CRs?
who gets the money?
Yeah.
State, feds, town? Where's the money going to go, essentially? It's going to trickle down to us, and we're going to get this leftovers. That's what I see happening.
The money's available to buy development, so the money goes from the feds to the landowner.
Are they going to take it from the forest lands from out west and give it to us? Because
This
Congress
is-
is not going to give us any more
This
money.
is going to be this is a new concept for the Forest Service. They haven't done this before. And to set this up, what they're going to do is fund it specifically for this. It's not a question of taking money from someplace else.
So the Congress is going to have to vote on this and pass it along with the Senate. And then it's got to get signed by the president. What, is this going to happen in my lifetime or
My mother is fairly obvious. It probably won't happen in her lifetime. I suspect most of us here will see.
Yes.
I went to the last regional one. That was in the community center in Shelburne Falls, or Shelburne, and it was packed. So now you've gone to how many communities? 20 or
Oh, no.
Franklin County? How many?
What have we done? 6? 6 out of 11.
Okay, so I certainly hope that you will go to a place like, I don't know, the auditorium at Mohawk or something, because if the participation here is indicative of anything, this would fill the community center down there. And it wouldn't be fair to have people out in the back trying to hear. And that'd be a good thing to do. When do you think you're going to know when it is?
When the regional meeting
Yeah.
would be? Probably I would, okay, let me just check what the schedule said. What we have right now is July, August, September, but, this is just a tentative schedule, so it could be in early fall.
Okay, thanks.
So how did FRCOG get involved in this?
Money.
Because this is a new approach to a National Forest Designation, this isn't a traditional approach where the Forest Service would come in and buy the land outright. And also the feedback that was gathered in the previous two projects to establish a traditional national forest, it was very clear to the state and the U.S. Forest Service that any hope of, having a federal designation in Massachusetts, the interest and participation needed to come from the local level and rise up. So because we're the regional planning agency and we serve all 26 towns in Franklin County, and we do a lot of outreach in our towns on all kinds of projects, we were the logical choice to do this work in Franklin County along with the Land Trust, who also works in Franklin County. And so Berkshire Regional Planning Commission was hired to work in their county. So, we have a long-term relationship with the town of Ashfield. The COG isn't going anywhere. So it was felt that we, as an agency, would be better at facilitating these meetings and gathering the input. Yes?
I just thought I'd give you my takeaway from this tonight. I'm really getting the feeling that someone, I don't know who, as Bill said, who is it up there, sees this privately owned large forest area as a potential profit for somebody. I'm not really clear from your presentation who gets the economic benefit of this. but I can't see how, you have not convinced me what the benefit to Ashfield is. One of the benefits you listed in an early slide was to raise the visibility of the area. Tell me why we would want to do that.
Well, maybe Ashfield wants to stay below the radar, but there are other towns in the study area where, for example, tourism is important, or developing markets for the forest-based businesses, in their region is important. So raising the visibility of the region really is a way of saying that funding would be made available to, brand the area, brand the products. Bob talked about some initiatives the state is undertaking to do that. So that's what that statement meant. But, if Ashfield's not interested in that, then that's fine.
Meaning
maybe Ashfield is only interested in the opportunity to access additional funding for conservation restrictions. Yes.
Why didn't you answer that question, like with one word, conservation? Why did you respond from a tourist point of view? I mean, I walked in here thinking this was going to buy conservation restrictions to help conserve forest land and promote whatever. But tourism, in my mind, was down here. Okay, so conservation has me squarely in. Tourism, so-so. So be careful of how you leave this meeting. I mean,
I was just addressing her, her concern about tourism being the focus. And remember, we're going out to each of the communities, and we might have an inkling of kind of what they're interested in, but this presentation has to be used to kind of lay the groundwork in each of the communities. And so as the discussion unfolds, it's pretty clear that there are issues with promoting tourism. Tourism is not, increasing that's not a concern. The concern is having additional funding for the conservation restriction. So,
can I just say, actually, my concern in that last question was, what is the advantage to Ashfield? And you have basically, pretty much through the evening, answered, well, other towns want this.
Well, we're asking you to help us figure out what the benefits to Ashfield are.
But maybe there are none.
Maybe there aren't any. Yeah, maybe there aren't any. But we're hoping, as that's what we need to hear. Do some benefits come to mind? Right, and if no benefits come to mind, then that's the feedback. So we're not here to say, I did have a list of potential benefits that had come up in the other meetings, but we're not here to say that those are the benefits for your town. Those are just examples. We want to understand what the potential benefits can be.
There are two people looking to speak, please.
Yeah.
And then their hands have been up quite a while.
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised with the negative feedback on tourism here, because tourism I think has historically been a significant part of life at Ashfield Lake, for example, and the summer people. So I'm not a fan of tourists in town personally, but I think you're maybe getting a mischaracterization of the importance of tourism to Ashfield.
And I'll speak as a tree farmer with a sugar house. We definitely depend on tourism. There are a number of sugar makers in this town that really would appreciate sales right out of the sugar house. And I realize that we are in the minority, but the money that we bring into this town during sugaring season is important.
Fall festival. Everyone here stop and think, how many people, tourists, do we have in Ashfield to pay for our kids to go to college? I think it runs around between 8,000 and 10,000 every year. We have seasonal events that take place here in town that very much depend on tourism. When you can get 10,000 people a day to come to this town for one event, that's pretty great. And same way with the sugar houses. We don't have as many now as we used to have, but we are known for those things that take place here, and people just come to be here, to see it, to do it. So I don't shun tourism. I just say we don't depend on it for our life as individual families or farms or whatever. We do depend on tourism too.
Yes.
You mentioned, and I heard this before, that there were other passes at U.S. Forest Designation. Do you know roughly when they were and who was doing it? I thought I'd like to read about it a bit and see what happened
Within the last 10 years, and it was, Bob was in EEA and the Forest Service, and there was a focus group that was established for one of them.
The EEA hired a group to do focus groups in 2009, I think, and they had, so they had about 100 people go to 12 different focus groups. There was town officials, there was landowners, and they weren't public meetings, but people were invited, and they spent a few hours talking to the facilitator about what the needs were and what kind of process they want. And that's kind of where we got the idea of hiring a local group like FRCOG and Berkeley Planning to work for the towns and having them kind of run it and mold it into something that could serve the needs of the towns and the residents if there was something here that would. This is the most heavily forested part of the state, these 20 towns, and they're also among the, not so true with Ashfield, but some of the smallest towns in the state are within these 20 towns. So, and then the regional plans that the two county planning agencies did kind of rise up some issues with kind of what were the economic benefits that might derive from the forest, and so it's just one of my jobs is to try to help forestry flourish more, but it's a challenge, and this is just kind of another tool in the tool chest to see if bringing more visibility, maybe more funding could make a model that could really work. But there are some other places in the country where it has worked. Buying local products, it's worked in agriculture in Massachusetts. It's a little more challenging for forestry, but it could work. And this is just a chance for people to kind of see whether there's a vision that could work, something to try.
So people wanted to look back at those other...
We have like a report from that focus group that we sent all the participated, but we could make it more public on the FRCOG website or something. That would, and you'll see from reading that the kind of the issues that people had and the recommendations, we are trying to follow those actually.
Yes.
Just wanted to see on the flow chart a keen interest in retaining the feel of Ashfield. We've spoken to it in many different ways here tonight, but I think it's pretty clear that nobody wants drastic changes in the landscape, in the population, in the traffic on the roads. I think that perhaps is what we're cautious about.
Well, it's 8 o'clock, so I don't want to keep people here too long. 2 more people raise their hands, and if they're quick, great. Yes.
One of the points that also makes it not a popular item is that when we built the new schools, we were promised monies for, say, transportation. We never got the money and this goes clear back to the 60s. So nothing has really changed as far as monies from government. And it's really hard to swallow when you got this smoke right there.
Yeah, I guess it's up to individual landowners, but as far as that goes, I mean, everybody's thinking about the quick fix of what we can do now, but the whole point of this thing is to keep the land tied up forever. I mean, some of this land has been in generations and generations and generations
A lot of people's homes wouldn't even be built if restrictions were done 200 years ago. I mean, yes, it's individuals, but tourism's not going to go away if we don't do this. And he just said all this stuff could happen. It could, it couldn't. But if it does or it doesn't, your land's gone. Or your conservation restrictions are gone, excuse me. But the private ownership isn't there anymore. And what's going to happen? Yeah, I'm not saying it's going to happen next year. It could happen 100 years from now. It could happen 200 years from now. If 2 federal senators or something want to do something down in Washington, and there's a national designation around here, what's going to stop them? When there's 1,000 or 2,000 acres around here with a federal designation that says, all of a sudden, well, you know what? I'll put your pipeline through Missouri if you put your new plant in Ashfield. I think just people keep that in mind, that's all.
Yeah, I came to this meeting, Dan said it was for me. And after hearing you talk about it and everybody else talk about it, I can see it being implemented with a bunch of tweaking. They might take the conservation reserves out, take care of your state forest first. When you take care of your state forest, we'll see what you've done, and then maybe they move in and do something else. But until you show us something, I wouldn't even think about it. And as far as your visitor center, tell them it'll be a perfect place. They want it, go ahead and put it. I've been to a lot of national parks, and I love those. There's so many demonstrations. I've always been enthused with them. But, and Rick mentioned a good thing with Mohawk, as far as putting in a wood or anything there, and showing what we can use our products for. But as far as the conservation restrictions, I'd eliminate that right to begin with. Just go to work in your state forest, show us what you can do. And as far as the visitor center, I know our representative here, we didn't have a visitor center in Greenfield, and now it's a 10 by 10 section, and it's a registry of motor vehicles.
Good. All right, a little after 8. Thank you all for coming. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.